the scholar. It was a cold winter day, and the scholar Shmuel was looking forward to Hanukkah starting that very night. He decided to spend the day in meditation to help the folks of Lublin, a nearby city. A friend had written him a letter asking him for help. The friend wrote that a terrible sickness was ravaging the town. Townsfolk were struck down with intestinal symptoms. Nobody felt safe. Many seemed to randomly succumb to the malady. As he was preparing to meditate upon this distressing news, the scholar's wife, Pearl, came to him. I'm going to visit my sister, for a couple of hours to bring her our Hanukkah greetings. I need you to watch the baby. She's taking her nap, so you can go on with your work. But if the baby wakes, rock the cradle. And there's some applesauce cooking on the stove. If it starts to boil over, push it away from the heat. Knowing how Shmuel could become lost in thoughts, she asked him, do you understand me? Shmuel said, don't be such a nudnik. No need to worry. I've got it. If the baby wakes, rock her. If the applesauce boils, move it. Feeling assured, Pearl went on her way to visit her sister. But as soon as Shmuel sat down in his rocking chair, he was struck with the realization. What my wife is asking me is a logical paradox. What if the applesauce boils over and the baby wakes at the exact same time? To do both simultaneously would be impossible. So he sat there thinking about this dilemma. The answer came to him in a vision. He dragged the rocking chair next to the kitchen stove. He dragged the baby cradle next to the rocking chair. He then tied a rope from his wrist to the pot on the stove so he could easily pull it off the heat. He then rested his foot on the rocker of the cradle so he could rock the cradle at the exact same time if the need arose. With the paradox resolved, he could now meditate upon the sickness in Lublin with his full concentration. He closed his eyes and thought about the suffering nearby. He would visualize each thought that came to him as a building block. And as the ideas flowed, he would, in his mind, lay one block upon the other until he constructed a tower of knowledge. First, he considered that the sickness might be caused by God. Perhaps Hashem is angry at the people of Lublin, as they are known to gossip incessantly. This idea will make a perfect foundation for my tower. Then he had an image of the Bystrika River, which flows through Lublin. Perhaps the damp air from the river is causing the sickness. He then visualized placing the second block on top of the first. As his meditation deepened, he had an image of the cold wind coming through the valley in Lublin. The folks of Lublin had a habit of wrapping their scarf around their faces to keep themselves warm in the cold wind. It could be that the scarf around their face is trapping the bad air and making them very sick. And so it went on. Shmuel added more and more blocks to his tower. But then his mind went to a darker place. His friend's letter had mentioned that many citizens were taking a special herb to try to prevent the sickness. Maybe the herbs are actually poisonous. Maybe these unscrupulous herb peddlers could unintentionally have been making people sick so they could sell more of their concoction and make more profit. Or worse yet, maybe the sickness is just an ordinary stomachache, but it's the people's fear of the sickness that attracts the evil eye. Now Shmuel's contemplation reached most profound levels. Perhaps there is no sickness at all. Perhaps it is just a story spread by the Tsar to take away people's freedom. The tower of blocks in Shmuel's mind had grown into a formidable yet precarious structure. One more idea was forming in Shmuel's head. He saw a tiny bug swimming in the well water. a bug that when people drank it would get angry and divide into 2 and then 4 and then 8 and more and more and more bugs. Oy vey! The bugs are attacking the folks from Lublin from the inside. Now this notion was meshuggah, crazy. He cautiously placed this last block on the tower in his mind, but it was too much. The now precarious tower began to totter, and then suddenly the whole mental structure collapsed into a heap with a raucous crash in his head. The crash seemed so real that it startled Shmuel, and his arms flew into the air. Well, what happened next happened very fast. As his arms flew up, the rope tied to his arm pulled the pot off the stove and onto the floor. And as it fell, some of the applesauce splattered onto his lap. He instantly jumped up, and when the hot sauce scorched him. And as he jumped up, his foot hit the rocker of the cradle. The cradle flew across the room, tipping the baby onto the floor. The startled baby began to scream. Pearl's timing was perfect. Just then she returned home from her visit and walked into the kitchen. She took one look at the scene in the kitchen. Oy vey, what happened here? Shmuel was still stunned. I don't know. I was silently meditating here, and just when I thought I was close to a divine revelation, the next thing I knew, the applesauce crashed to the ground. The baby was on the floor screaming. It must have been a dybbuk, an evil spirit in the kitchen. Curiously, Pearl just shook her head and said, Not again, Shmuel. She calmly quieted the baby and went about making latkes for their Hanukkah meal. And miraculously, there was just enough applesauce in the pot for each of the 8 nights of Hanukkah.